Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Forge. My name is Yvonne Phyllis, and I am the co-director of operations at the Forge. My role tonight is to introduce the Forge and to give a little bit of our context of why we're here tonight, and also introduce our incredible speakers tonight. We really are in great hands. So I'm going to talk briefly about the work of the Forge. So when I refer to the Forge, I am referring to 87 Dakota Street, where we are, which is a multi-use center. Some have referred to it as a community center. I am also referring to the space on 14 Reserve Street, which is the Commune Bookshop, named after the Paris Commune. And both spaces have a very specific mandate. The two spaces mandate is to specifically engage progressive Pan-African ideas and more broadly radical ideas. By this we mean anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, feminism, issues pertaining to sexuality, and most importantly to our work, to engage the lived experiences and struggles of working class people and impoverished people. So that is the broad mandate of the Forge. And at the Forge, we think about work as a number of things. We think about work as a book launch. We think about work writing a book, a poetry session, a musical performance, a theater performance. For us, work is a variety of things. And for us, cultural work is instrumental to the success of the project. And very fitting to our work, we think very carefully and deeply and in a complex way about history and heritage. And that is fitting for tonight's discussion. And I said when I started that we are in great hands. Tonight, we are celebrating Umama Charlotte Maxeke, her life and her politics. And the theme for tonight's discussion is Charlotte Mannya Maxeke, a woman ahead of her time. So before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to contextualize the discussion by referring to their work. And tonight we borrow from what Dr. Athambile Masola refers to as ukuzilanda. And ukuzilanda, this is how she refers to it, literally meaning to fetch oneself. It is a concept that encompasses practices and rituals through which people bring the past into conversation with their present, or with their present reality. And she uses a common example, and she says a common example is reciting family names, iziduko in isiXhosa, when introducing oneself to new people. The family, or the list of family names, locates one as part of a longer lineage and history, bringing that history to bear on the present. So, what ukuzilanda encourages us to do is to think more deeply about history, about historiography, and about heritage. And it also encourages us to challenge the erasure of women and their work. Otherwise, if we don't do that, asizokwazi ukuzilanda. And also, as Dr. Thozama April encourages us to do, is to examine the problematic insertion of women into histories of liberation struggles. And she encourages us to think of Umama Charlotte Mannya Maxeke as someone who epitomized women's struggle against deprivation of basic rights, such as dignity, happiness, education, employment opportunities, and property ownership. And so this is, of course, a different way or a different introduction to the work and the life of Umama Charlotte Maxeke. It's different to what we've come to know, or which is what is presented to us or how she's presented to us as the mother of the liberation struggle. So Ukuzilanda then encourages us to do this kind of work. And of course, we know that the personal is the political. And Zubeida does this very beautifully. This is how she talks about and describes Umamu Maxeke. Zubeida writes, Maxeke rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She made up her own mind about where to focus her energies. She chased her dreams and came into her own, defying the architects of both colonialism and apartheid. Hers was a triumphant spirit that powered on in spite of the multitude of odds staked against her. So again, when I said we're in great hands, this is what I meant. So tonight, as I said in the beginning, the theme for today's discussion is Charlotte Mannya Maxeke, a woman ahead of her time. And of course, we know that she was born on the 7th of April in 1871, which would have been her 150th birthday, so that was yesterday. And tonight, we do the work that celebrates her. And we have with Dr. Athambile Masola, who will be our facilitator tonight. And we have Dr. Thozama April, who will be our discussant tonight. And our main speaker is Zubeida Jaffer. And I'm going to introduce them in that order. And before I do that, I want to announce that this is a collaboration between the Forge and Number 10 Publishers. Dr. Athambile Masola, the founder of the Asinakuthula Collective, which can be found at www.asinakuthula.org, a collective of teachers and researchers interested in women's history. She is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in the English department. Her research has been published in academic journals, literally magazines, blogs, and she's currently working on a children's book related to Black women's historiography. And we have Dr. Thozama April, who is a senior curator at the National Heritage Council and Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Fort-Hare. She holds a PhD in history from the University of the Western Cape. Her thesis, Theorizing Women, the Contributions of Charlotte Maxeke to the Struggle for Liberation in South Africa, examines Charlotte Maxeke as part in the liberation struggle. And then our main speaker tonight is Zubeida Jaffer, who is an award-winning journalist, an author, and an activist. She has recently launched Number 10 Publishers to take ownership of her 3 books and to codify her over 40 years of journalism experience. The 3 books, Our Generation, Love in the Time of Treason, and Beauty of the Heart, the Life and Times of Charlotte Mannya Maxeke, span 130 years of South African history, stretching from 1871 to 2001. She is a graduate of the University of Cape Town, of Rhodes University, and obtained her MSc at Columbia University in New York. Her website, www.zubeidajaffer.co.za, publishes a selection of her own articles and those of others that have attracted her attention and links to her online bookshop. And with that, let us please welcome our incredible speakers. Thank you so much, Dr. Athambile. Thank you so much, Dr. Thozama. Thank you so much, Zubeida. We really are honored to have you at the Forge, and we look forward to today's conversation. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Athambile.
Thank you, Yvonne. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for setting the scene, and thank you to all the organizers, the Forge, and everyone who's been involved in getting us here tonight, which is really an exciting opportunity for me to see two of my favorite people, whom I first met many years ago. Well, it feels like many years ago. And it seems every time we meet, we're talking about this wonderful woman. So it's really exciting for me to be here. And I'm not going to waste any time. We're just going to get straight into the conversation. And I want to ask a question that I feel like I've always taken for granted when I've had conversations with you. And I want to start right at the beginning, because I think what we miss in this work sometimes is the work of being in the archive. And I want to start with your first encounter with the name, but also the process of writing the book. And I want us to start and think of it in the sense of, when did you first meet Charlotte Mannya Maxeke? And just that process of unfolding her story. And it's a question that I'd like both of you to start with. I'll start with you, Zubeida.
Thank you so much, Athambile. Wonderful to be here with both of you. We do tend to land on the same platforms from time to time. And I'm often asked this question, you know, how did I get involved in writing this story? And I must say it is something that really just happened completely by chance. I was on the campus of the University of the Free State, and I saw a poster advertising the memorial lecture to Mum Charlotte, and I asked Professor Jonathan Jansen, who was walking the campus with me, what do you know about this woman? I'd heard the name in relation to the hospital, but I had not really known anything else about her. And then he suggested I talk to the people organizing the lecture at the university. Went there, and once I'd gone there, I was really concerned, because my sense was that the information was all over the show, that it was a bit, unclear. And when I said that to him, he said to me, so why don't you do the research, and why don't you write a story? And, normally I hesitate. Many people come to me, ask me to write these stories. And my first response is no, because I know once you decide to write someone's story, you live with them for, a couple of years. And, you don't always want to live with everybody. So what is extraordinary about this moment, right there on the campus, was that I didn't hesitate. I just said yes. And I still don't understand that. If I knew what was waiting for me, I would have thought twice, because it was climbing a mountain. Just climbing a mountain. And if it wasn't for Thozama April's careful record of archive which she had done earlier, I would have had nothing to start off with. So there's a lot of thanks due to her. I have shaped it into a story. I've shaped it and pulled together the different threads of the life, with the assistance of a number of students who did all who helped me with a lot of the legwork, going through the newspapers of the 1800s. But I think Thozama's a record of the archive was a huge help in providing me with the initial kind of source, the initial sources to dig further into. And there were a number of issues that was very problematic. Even at birth date, there were 2 birth dates. And yesterday on the radio, and I did 8 interviews yesterday, from 6:30 in the morning till 10 o'clock last night. Still, sadly, I was so disappointed that at least on one radio station, not deliberately, but, they referred to the birth date as 1874, and they referred to the birthplace as Ramagopa village. So, because on the internet there are these different versions, and I'd hoped that by writing this book that I would pull together and synthesize all of that so that there's a reason, not necessarily, one can never be absolutely sure, but for example, with the birth date, just to illustrate, I came to an educated conclusion that she was born in 1871 because I couldn't find, birth certificates. I tried. I couldn't find church records. I couldn't find any paperwork. I even went as far as to approach the Minister of Home Affairs at that time, Dr. Naledi Pandor, and she tried too. We tried to go back as far as we could, but we couldn't get, any documentation. And so in the end, I chose the date of 1871 because there was an interview with her sister, Katie Makanya, that was on record in the book that's been written about her, where she says that the mother had written in the Bible that her date, Katie's birth date, was in 1873. So if Katie was born in 1873 and Charlotte was the eldest, Charlotte couldn't have been born in 1874. So the date that we have at the moment is an educated guess, taking a whole lot of things into consideration, but really making, we made a superhuman effort to try and get, the correct detail.
You're raising so many things about that process, and I want to come to you, Thozama, because what you're raising are the barriers when it comes to finding information. So what does it mean when there are no records? How do we do research when there are no records? And you this image of climbing a mountain, and it's thanks to other women's work that we're able to climb those mountains because we're using that as a foundation for our work. So I want you to tell us then, if Zubeida was using your work, where did you start?
Well, thanks, Athambile, and also I just also wish to extend my sense of gratitude to the Forge and everyone that's involved in this initiative. Just to come to your question about where I first encountered Maxeke in my undergraduate courses, and I think it was in 1999, if I'm not mistaken, in a course that dealt with women's history in Southern Africa. I think it was a broad survey of women's struggles in Southern Africa, and I kept coming across Maxeke's name, and at that time there was very little substantive engagement with what she was about, and I got interested in her story. I remember coming across a reference that acknowledged Maxeke as having been this very influential figure among Africans in the early 20th century, and yet the conclusion was that her work was inconsequential. And it is then that I felt that there was something amiss in that conclusion. That if Maxeke was this influential figure, how come that her works become inconsequential? So I then set out to really figure out the extent of her influence in society. It is then that I took up the challenge of pursuing her life story, purely from an academic kind of interest that I had identified gaps in her story, that even within available literature on women's histories, that her life story didn't have all the basic biographical details that you need. Just going back to add on to what Zubeida was saying, the difficulty of locating Maxeke's birth date and her place of birth, I also came across that challenge. But for me, what has really been enlightening was coming across, through further research, coming across the interviews Charlotte Maxeke did. And in one of the interviews she did in 1891, while she was on tour in England, she cites her own birth date and her place of birth. So it is then that we could conclude conclusively in agreement with Zubeida. And I also wish to acknowledge her as well. And I think had it not been her dedication to the story, her ability using her journalistic skills to piece together the different threads, because in that thesis, mine was merely an archival excavation, which has sought to put in different elements of archival traces together. And what Zubeida Jaffer did was to pull in those different threads into a story. And I also wish to reciprocate her by acknowledging that hard work of putting things together. So it is really, for me, it was out of an academic interest coming across a reference to a name which at that time was just cited in passing with very little substantive engagement with what she represented and what she was about. Yeah.
You're also raising so many important points, because I think one of the things that people, I hear this a lot, well, why aren't we writing more stories? Why aren't we writing more stories? And what I want to tease out from you, and the reason why I started with this question, is for people to understand the difficulty of archival work. It's not a matter of I'm just piecing information here and there and I'm just going to reproduce it for the internet. It's what I often say is bums on seats. It's students being able to do that work for you. It's institutions being able to back you up. It's the time that it takes to be and sit in that archive. So when we say archival work is labor, it really is that. And you're sitting and you're mining for information. And I really want that to come across today, because I think people take for granted as though we're just kind of, I mean, it's not thumb-sucking, but people make it look easy. And in order to acknowledge the intellectual labor that it takes in order for books like this to come about. And maybe just as an extension of that, particularly just for you to come back to Thozama, what challenges did you find then in the archive? And maybe Zubeida, you can talk about, so we've spoken about the date, just locating her birthplace was just something that we take for granted. I mean, I still remember William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, or lived in so those are facts that people want to roll off, but it's laborsome work to be able to get to that point. What are the other challenges that you noticed with what we call the archive? And I know it's a very problematic thing. It's not just something that's sitting there ready for you to dig up. What were some of those challenges? I can come back to you, Zubeida.
You know, I'm very thankful for my journalism training, because one of the things that we are supposed to do, I notice sometimes it's not done, but we are supposed to have two sources to corroborate a fact. And so the challenge for me was that this information came in from Thozama's archive, and then the information came in from students, but for me it was always getting a second confirmation. There's second confirmation. For example, with the Women's March in Bloemfontein, you know, even this week there was just, you know, repeated, and I've said it so many times to so many people, that Mam Charlotte didn't lead the Pass Law March in Bloemfontein. It was Mrs. Molisa Poli, I think. Did I say that correctly? And I went out of my way because there was this repeated story, this mythology that she was the one who, you know, who led the march in Bloemfontein. It was even enacted in Bloemfontein while I was there, you know, this march. So it's not that I didn't want it to be so. It's just that I wanted to be sure that it was so. And so I really battled with that one. And I eventually couldn't find confirmation. I could only find confirmation of the the actual reports of that march and the actual happenings on those days and the bravery of the women, coloured and African women in Bloemfontein. And yes, Mum Charlotte got involved, boots and all, eventually through the process, and took it onto a sort of a national campaign. But she wasn't the one who initiated and led those protests. So even there, you see, and I feel, yes, we can be shoddy, and we can, make up stories like Afrikaner nationalism made up about Jan van Riebeeck. He was here only for 8 years, and yet we think, he built the castle and he did everything. Those stories were made up. And for over 300 years, we have lived with made-up stories. And I'm very concerned that Mum Charlotte's story mustn't become a made-up story. As we go along, we repeat incorrect facts. Why? Our children don't deserve that. Our children deserve the best, the highest quality of information, and the most authentic stories that they must imbibe and take into their souls and it'll move them forward. And so the accuracy of information is important, the accuracy. Sometimes it doesn't matter too much, but why should we not, attain to a high standard of information? Why not?
And that accuracy does matter when it comes to black women's lives, in fact. I think that's what you're pointing to. We must care enough to find that accuracy. You were working at, I think, Robben Island at some point, and this is where you kind of had these challenges with the archive. Can you speak a bit about that, about how you dealt with the challenge of the archive? And I'm speaking in general terms.
Yeah, just coming to that question of the archive, and as we all know that the idea of the archive itself is a colonial invention. Now, the ordering of archival material still bears traces of colonial epistemologies. I'll take the example of the absence of a record on Maxeke's birth. Now, if you were to go back, the idea of recording people's birth, in colonial times, Africans were never part of population registration. So, if you were to think that gap in the archive translates as an erasure, so it is built in the making of the archive itself. So understanding that the workings of the archive itself perpetuates the kind of mythologies you're talking about. Because in the absence of the record, I remember when I started with the story of Charlotte Maxeke, it was as if you're talking about something that does not exist. It is as if you're making her story up. She never existed. She never existed as a thinker. She never existed as an activist. It is as if it's something that you are making it up. It is only when we begin to locate the different archives that have records of Maxeke's activities that we are able to tell her story. So for me, it was the hard labor of working the archive, but also identifying the workings of the archive as a limitation. There's something limiting about the archive itself, that whenever we approach it, it does not have all the answers that we have. It is then that we begin to see these lives forming outside the domain of colonial administration. Mm-hmm. For Maxeke's life is not inscribed in that archive. Mm-hmm. When you go to records of population registration in Cape Town, for example, you won't find a record of Charlotte Maxeke because it is built in the making of the archive itself. Mm. So it speaks to the whole idea of colonial epistemology, how colonial understandings continue to shape our understanding of the past. So my learning through the journey with Maxeke was also coming across those limitations. But those were limitations that taught me a lesson, that You go to the Colonial Archive, you're not going to get anything. Yes.
I feel like we need a masterclass on just the idea of the archive, because, I mean, that idea, that's such a powerful statement, the archive as erasure, because we like to treat it as though it's a place of authority. But actually, it in and of itself, it needs to be interrogated. So thanks for making that powerful point. And so I want to come to the story. I wanted to start with the backstory before we come to the story. And so one of the things that everybody, hopefully by now, knows about Charlotte is this idea that she went to Wilberforce University. And I really want us to spend a little bit of time just teasing that out, because I think we take it for granted what it meant for someone in that period to have gone to an institution abroad. And I know it went via other journeys. So Zubeida, if you could read a bit of that context and what that world meant for her to get to Wilberforce. And then we'll tease out some threads from that.
Sure, Athambile. I'm going to take you now to 1894. And these two sisters, Katie and Charlotte, they are returning from Britain, where they sang for the Queen. And that's a whole other story. But this is now chapter 4. They're coming home. And I'm going to read to you what I've written. The railway line snaked past the back of their home in Kimberley, and from the train, the girls spotted their parents in the distance. They were standing on the back porch waving a white sheet. Their brother Philip and a large group of friends were gathered at the station to greet them, and later they all crowded into their happy home with great excitement. Later that evening, before everyone left, their father said a prayer in thanks for their safe return. And when they went to bed that night, they removed their tight corsets and left behind their stiff English life, confident that they could move into a foreign space with ease. Katie was back to where she felt most at home, and back where the food was familiar and their tongues unstrained. This is Katie, she found work as a domestic in the town. But Charlotte was preparing for a trip to America with a second choir. Katie was adamant that she was not going to go abroad again. She wanted to find a husband and was wondering about Charlotte and her romantic inclinations. When she asked her sister whether she wanted to get married, Charlotte said she was not ready. Charlotte was formidable, and Katie was unsure whether young men would find it easy to approach her. Would Charlotte have been conscious of this? Was finding a life partner an issue for her then? Would she have mulled over what it meant to be a strong, educated woman in a changing environment? She had one foot in the old world and one in the new. Millions of women were yet to follow her path and find themselves in exactly the same position, trying to make sense of the value of old ways against the backdrop of the new. Don't we all know that? 3 months after arriving back home, Charlotte left for America. Her journey across the seas in 1894 was not easy. There was a terrible storm forcing those aboard to stay in locked cabins for days. Imagine the 23-year-old young woman rocking in a bunk and dreaming of finding a way to further her education. Could there have been moments when she thought that her dreams would end at sea? All she was certain of then was that if she made it to the shores of America, she would be singing as part of a choir. She had no idea how this would convert into her aim of finding a place of study at a university. Could a mind have wandered to Titus Mbongwe, who had left Kimberley with so much hope a time earlier and then was killed in a train crash in a faraway country? Was she plagued with doubts, or was she comfortable in a youthful certainty? The problem seemed to solve itself. After a few months of touring, the choir once again hit a wall of financial troubles. The English managers abandoned them and left them stranded, as it happened in Britain. Fortunately, the story of their plight was reported in the local newspapers and attracted the attention of the ministers of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, who came to their rescue.
I'm looking for a cliffhanger because people must buy this and read it for themselves. So don't get to the exciting part just yet. We want to get to a point where people must know that they must buy this so that they can read this story for themselves. So I wonder if we could pause there.
Okay.
And just to say, yes, the book is available for people to read and people must buy it. And I think one of the things that extract also shows is the ways in which you chose to position the story as quite, I don't want to say, the words that's coming up is lyrical, but quite accessible. So you're casting the imagination, you're using imagination because of some of those gaps, and so you need to make space for that. And so maybe speak more about how did you choose to frame this book? But before you answer the question, I also want to add, people can pose their questions on the YouTube chats. We are going to be taking some questions a little later on. But what were the choices that you made in order to write the story in the way that you did? Because it's also not a very stuffy history book in that it's dense. There's something quite light about the story. And what choice did you make to do that?
You know, I was actually fortunate, if I think back, because I was offered a position of writer in residence at the University of the Free State. And so when I was doing this work, I was at the University of the Free State. But it was really, I realized very quickly that I'm not an academic. And when I was working on this book, and I did the initial sort of outline and said this is what I was going to do, the conversation I had with Professor Jansen made me realize that there were certain expectations academically. And I listened to this, and I listened to what was asked of me in terms of academic speak, and I was very clear, you know. Maybe if I was younger, I would have buckled, but I was very clear. I said, I'm sorry, if this is what you want me to do, then you have to find someone else to do it. I am a storyteller and a journalist, and my big thing is to communicate clearly. And I cannot write in an academic way that nobody understands what I'm saying. I cannot do that. In principle, I cannot do it. I believe that it's unnecessary. I believe that that has to be challenged, but that's another story. So I said, I'm prepared to make a compromise. The compromise otherwise you find someone else. The compromise I'm prepared to make is that I will very heavily, the book will be obviously heavily researched, and I will footnote extensively. And in that way, kind of meet the requirements, the requirements of academic rigor. With Thozama's laughing. And that's, I understand that problem because now it's in the university context. You have to, you have to work with where you are. And so I said, I will do that. But if you're going to want me to produce a book that 2 people can read in the country, then I'm not interested in doing the book.
And I'm so glad you did that, because a story like Charlotte Mannya Maxeke's story should be accessible, because I think it's the people's story. And I think it's so important. I mean, we know this in the academic world, is that we're constantly thinking of ways. I mean, what's the justice question if you're going to write in a way that is inaccessible? And I mean, it's a long conversation about academies and academic writing that we're also still fighting, whether it comes to the English that is required of us, the kind of academies that is required of us, the ways in which African languages are used in that process. So even the idea of, writing Charlotte's story, I mean, she was multilingual, right? That's, which is one of the things you write about. What would it mean to have her story accessible in multiple languages as well? So it's really encouraging. I think it's important for people to hear that we must be able to resist the ways in which writing can be controlled in the academic space. But to come to you, Thozama, what were the choices that you had to make when you were constructing? I mean, in one sense, it's academic writing, but what were the things that you were resisting as you were telling the story?
Yeah, my experience is the opposite of what Zubeida just said, because for postgraduate studies, you have to abide by those requirements. So my struggle was in trying to fit Maxeke's story in those conventions, which till today I'm still struggling. That Maxeke's life story does not conform, to the standards set for biographical construction, for example. When you write a biography, you need all that paperwork that supports, your conventional understanding of what a biography is. But there have been innovative ways of beginning to reclaim lives lost in that tradition. That of using your imagination, for example, what you've just cited now, that in thinking about Maxeke's life story, it is in a context. You contextualize her life. Now, when we begin to think about Maxeke's era, born in 1871, what is happening in 1871? That is then that one begins to broaden your research networks by establishing the context in which she lived. Then we are beginning to claim a life that has been erased. So it is finding those innovative ways of working yourself within the limits of the archive, but also cognizant of its limits, but also devising means that begin to tell a story that would not have been possible, So for me, it was really using a bit of imagination, but also because the requirements for a postgraduate study were such that you had to abide by the conventions of academic writing. And I must also confess, it's very difficult. You can't write Charlotte Maxeke's story into an existing frame of what we've already been taught in historical writing, in historiographies. That's why I define her as someone that has kind of taken us to a process of reorientating us. She reorients the whole understanding of our historiography. She reorients our understanding of the intellectual life of Africans in South Africa, which is something that is often kind of written in passing, but without really kind of engaging with that kind of life, the life they led. So for me, it's acknowledging the gaps, but also thinking creatively as to how do we begin to reclaim her life story in the midst of all these gaps, all these limitations, archival inscriptions that were by design meant to obliterate the agency of Africans.
I want us to stay with that point for a little bit, because the question of historiography is a very sore point. I think for those of us who are in the academy, but also if we think of how history is framed in this country. And one of the things that I found quite curious, and I mean, we could spend a whole evening talking about historiography alone, and that maybe there's another masterclass that you should do for us. But I want to pick up on some of the things that I've become quite curious about in this historiography, and maybe you could pick up in the way in which people were engaging you with questions yesterday. One of the things that I found is quite underplayed is her role in the AME Church. And I wondered if you could just speak to some of what you found, because it's almost kind of around the back that it was her. She was at the center of that story. The fact that the AME Church comes to South Africa in the way that it did is because of what she was doing in Americas. So just speak to that, because I think, and maybe it's because people don't want to highlight this question of the missionary influence and her education, but how was she engaging with even those questions of Christianity and the role that Christianity was playing with her agency? I know it's quite a big one, and maybe you can choose which angle you want to come at it, but I want people to be able to understand what was her role in the AME Church as well. I mean, we don't have all night, so you're going to have to find a way of...
Can I just say something quickly? When I visited the village, Ramagopa village, I was so impressed with the way, how beautiful the church, that people in the village had maintained that church. Very beautiful. In fact, it should be some place where we go to for special occasions. But what made me sad was that her name wasn't on the. It was only. I think it was a male. It was about male and female. I don't think it was about missionary. I don't know. We need to do more work on that. But I think it was to do with the names of the men were there, and her name wasn't there. Her pictures was in the church, you know. Not a fantastic picture, and I've been asking that isn't been effort for somebody to do a painting, but she her name isn't on that original church, and so the whole research into the Amy Church, Thozama, I don't know if you're going to, you know, put it onto your list, onto your, or if we're going to find another research student or academic who's going to just do that. Because I've said it over and over that my book pulls together all the threads, but each thread can be further and further, you know, interrogated and researched. And so it is, you know, I think the church, you know, there must be many more records that can be accessed. We superficially actually touched that, eh? And we didn't have the cooperation. I certainly didn't have the cooperation of the Amy Church, sadly. So we need somebody who will have the cooperation of the Amy Church and who will go through all those records for a couple of years. And they will get much more on Charlotte, I'm sure.
I mean, I was shocked even, sorry to just jump in, I was shocked that she'd written hymns as well. Dr. Disani had sent me some hymns, that's just kind of not spoken about. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just in terms of Maxeke, the extent of Maxeke's involvement in the founding of the Amy Church in South Africa, I think it goes back to the whole question of archiving, because when the Amy Church is established in South Africa, of course, Maxeke is the one that facilitated the very first letter from Mongane Mugone to the AME Church in the US was facilitated by her. But when the AME Church is established, I think their first conference was in Port Elizabeth. That is where they established, for the first time, they established a committee that was given a task to document the history of the AME Church. And quite surprisingly, in those documents, Maxeke was not included in the committee that was established. Yet, she was very instrumental and also in attendance at the conference. So one begins to see how she is marginalized even within the workings of the archive of the church itself. So the whole question of the archive, I'm happy, Athambile, you raised this at the beginning, because there is no way that we can write these stories without engaging the question of the archive, because that is where we all go to. And yet, that is where some of the major kind of erasures take place. So when you think about Maxeke and how she is represented in the narrative of the AME Church itself, it's really really problematic in the sense that you don't get, for me, that was the very first conference that the AME Church had, and it had taken it upon itself to write its own history. And in its writing, it erases the most important figure who was instrumental in its founding in South Africa.
And so you're raising a question of what does it mean for even someone as active and as visible as Charlotte Mannya Maxeke to fall through the cracks.
Exactly.
But for me, those are decisions that people make. So there are people who are in those conferences, who are putting together those documents, who are saying who should be invited and who should be not. So when we talk of Eurasia, I think it's important for us to link it to a set of decisions. Not that it's something that happens just by fluke. It's something that people do. And not to make it a passive process, but rather an active process. Another part of the story that's curious for me is the question of relationships. And I want to come to the relationships in Charlotte Mannya Maxeke's life, because I think one of the critiques that's coming up more and more is this idea of she was alone. So when I first started reading about her, I was curious to then find Adelaide Tansi and Nogutela Dube, and in a sense that all these women were contemporaries. But somehow, again, because history are these profiles, we don't write about the relationships. So perhaps if you could say something more, and it's curious because her entry into the world is through a choir. Now, there's nothing more communal than a choir. No one sings in a choir by themselves. That's a solo. There are even two words that are different, you know. So she is born in, not so much she is born into and enculturated through community. But somehow when history remembers her, she is as though she can only stand alone, that there's only room for just one Charlotte. So maybe if you could say more about the relationships with the women in the choir. There's the Bantu Women's League, there's the National Council of African Women, and in a sense, who were her comrades, who were her friends? I want to know who the people she gossiped with. You know, I want to imagine her at a tea party, or drinking whiskey in secret maybe, because we also want her to be this respectable woman. Maybe she wasn't that. I mean, those are the speculative things that I'd like to see, but say more about her relationships that were quite formative for her in relation and building her intellectual, her cultural world. And maybe Zubeida, if you want to go first, if there's an extract you want to read to answer that.
I think what is very fascinating is the Kimberley Circle. And I refer to the Kimberley Circle because, you know, when we were raised and we were at school, you know, we knew about the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, and we, you know, got to know that. But we didn't get to know anything about the young intellectual Africans in the Kimberley area that were the musicians, the teachers, the journalists. Saul Plaatje was a contemporary, and the most magnificent role models that we can draw on, and they were all part of one little group. You know, like you, like I saw today, the people at the Forge, you know, a group of people that are doing things together. And so in the book, I do describe that phenomenon. And so Charlotte wasn't alone. I mean, certainly never alone. She stepped ahead of her time. I mean, she sort of was more bold, I think. I get that sense. She was more bold often. But she was part of a collective of young people who were very committed to pushing education and pushing the country forward and moving into, you know, and embracing the changes that had come. And little did they know, this is the end of the 1800s, 1890s, that time, 1880s, when suddenly with the discovery of diamonds and later of gold, there was just these huge resources unlocked in our country. And so huge possibilities, but those resources were not used for our benefit. Those resources were moved offshore. And those resources were used to set up universities that were for the colonial communities. So at the time, there were a few white women, I think about 4, who got degrees before Charlotte, but they could get degrees because they could get it here in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, which is mainly from diamond and gold money. But she had to travel abroad, she and others, and Marshall, her husband, and others had to travel abroad to get their education, very far away. So what was going on here at the time was there was a natural evolution and, emergence of an intelligentsia and, a young impetus towards, a modern lifestyle, but the social forces in the country were directed against them. So we often don't know that. We think that we get told, or we have this image, oh, there were these barbarians running around who had to be tamed. And these barbarians were running around. And so then the colonials came and they did all these things. That's in our minds. I mean, that's how it's presented. But it wasn't like that. It was a shift in the world where slowly electricity came and various other things came, and so people were getting the benefits, and through that there was shifts. And just as it happened in other countries, it happened here too. We had
and that there was electricity in Kimberley before there was electricity in London.
That's right.
But people don't want to talk about that.
Yes.
Maybe Thozama, you could just tell us more about her community
Yeah.
And those influences.
Yeah. Just following her story, one gets a sense of Maxeke growing up. Of course, she had a circle of the people she grew up with, the Kimberley circle, of course, the choir, the names of the people that were in the choir, we are able to follow them to establish a sense of a presence of other people in her circle, if you like. But for me, where I was able to get a sense of Maxeke's contemporaries and the people that she was in conversation with was in Wilberforce. There, she is in the midst of a very kind of progressive network of black thinkers of the time, Nina Goma, W.E.B. Du Bois, and she is taught by Harlequin Brown, who is a feminist and a very kind of renowned elocutionist. Hence, she is known to have been very eloquent. She was trained by the best. So this is the network of people who were also her mentors. And not only that, you also have a number of South Africans who were also students at Wilberforce while she was still there. Names of people such as Johanna Hoos from Cape Town. You also had Utyatyadwa Tanzi. You had Sibusisiwe Makanya. I mean, these are people that are students at the time she is there as well. So you do get a few kind of names that are beginning to surface to be able to establish a sense of a network of people Charlotte Maxeke was in conversation with. But the one thread that I followed was that of Maxeke's interaction with W.E.B. Du Bois, because that is documented in correspondence between her and Du Bois long after she had left Wilberforce. So there's a sense in which Maxeke's network, her peers, but there's a purpose that drive these relationships. Now, each relationship it defines an aspect of her activism, if you like, So the Kimberley Circle, it's a group of young people who are determined to rise above whatever limitations they experienced, and they use the art, the music, as a means to advance their cause of acquiring education. Now, once abroad, she gets into a network of like-minded people who are also in this whole mission of advancing a cause, an anti-colonial kind of program of resisting colonial domination, but also promoting the culture, the values of people who were subjected to colonial domination. So each circle of Maxeke's network tells a story. it defines her character. It tells the kind of work she was involved in, but also her interests. They come alive when we follow that network. And just lastly, one person that inspires me a lot is Mama Ellen Kuzwayo, how she defines Maxeke in her very first encounter with Maxeke. And she tells it beautifully in her autobiography, Maxeke's presence and how she was viewed among Africans. I mean, that is the only vivid kind of narration of Maxeke from someone who had met her.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because what she does so beautifully in that book as well is to connect her to Minasoka, whom she had mentored. And that for me was the first time I got to see her in relation to other people, and it's so, so beautiful. So thanks for bringing that up. I see you, there's an extract maybe you want to bring, and then we're going to come to the questions.
I'm not sure if it's time. I'm not sure if it's time, but, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the greatest Pan-African intellectuals of the 20th century, wrote something specifically about Charlotte 30 years after he met her. And I wondered if we have a minute to, should I read it? Yeah. He writes the following. I've known Charlotte Mannya Maxeke since 1894, when I went to Wilberforce University as a teacher. She was one of the 3 or 4 students from South Africa and was the only woman. She was especially the friend of Nina Goma, the student who afterwards became my wife. We were interested in Charlotte Mannya because of her clear mind, her fund of subtle humor, and her straightforward honesty of her character. She was having difficulties with language in the new environment, but she did her work with slow, quiet determination that augured well for her future. I've had the opportunity of following her work through the glimpses which I've had from far off South Africa. I regard, and then he says, makes this really powerful statement, I regard Mrs. Maxeke as a pioneer in one of the greatest of human causes, working under extraordinarily difficult circumstances to lead a people in the face of prejudice, not only against her race, but against her sex. To fight not simply the natural, inherent difficulties of education and social uplift, but to fight with little money and little outside aid was indeed a tremendous task. I think that what Mrs. Maxeke has accomplished should encourage all men, and especially those of African descent. And in addition to that, it should inspire the white residents of South Africa and of America to revise hastily made just judgments concerning the possibilities of the Negro race.
Thank you for reading that. Such a beautiful tribute. And again, so many threads we could pick up. But if there are any questions, maybe we should get to that for the next few moments.
Hi everyone at home. My name is Fezo Mtwanti. I'm the Performing Arts Programmer. I'm so moved. I'm so excited. I'm so thrilled to have all of you here today. And that is the feeling on the other side. People are so deeply, deeply excited and deeply actually humbled, I would say, by the conversation that we're having here today. Just before I go into the questions, as you're all talking about historiography, I just want to say to those, we have a radical forging histories calendar at the Forge, and we know that this week we celebrated the formation of the PAC, of which W.E. Du Bois was so instrumental in. At the Commune, we're going to have a Robert Sobukwe screening. So just check out our socials. So thank you so much. And you were speaking about Tunogutele Dube. We're going to be showing her documentary by Shalif Keita later on in the month. So thank you for making these gorgeous links today. Cool. So we have Somile Tondashe, who says, archival work is so challenging because of its limits on Black South African women. Regarding the violence of the archive, please read Venus in 2 Acts by Sadia Hartman. So I think that's more a comment, but Sadia Hartman is fantastic. Then we have Uxolile Titus, who says, thankful for the session. Please, can you expand on the connection with Fort Beaufort? How many questions can we take?
Maybe just a round of 3 for now.
Sure. Cool. I have 6.
Okay, so let's do 3 and then answer and then 3.
Sure. Andrew says, I lived in Everton Township in the 1970s. Did Umama like I live in Everton, as I see the Wilberforce Training College in Everton has a mural in her honor? Then we have so many amazing people. I see Kollega Shanges on the chat. I see Nomfundo Kaluva. If it is the Nomfundo Kaluva, I think it is. It's the jazz amazing Nomfundo who did the cover of Yakalinkomo, which is so gorgeous. And then, can I ask another question?
Yeah, and then
Sure. Ukatu Mashua, I hope I'm not butchering your name, says, how can I ensure that her story is told? Many people do not know her story. And then I'll ask the next 2 questions after this.
would you like to choose which question is more appropriate? Yeah.
Yes, Everton, I have an entire chapter on Everton in the book. So I would advise that listener reads that. She was instrumental in creating and setting up the whole Everton schooling and training centers for priests. And so, yes, she was very strongly, and she had lived there briefly before moving to another part of Johannesburg. And then I think about how to get the story out there. I'm very concerned that, people take little snatches, but in a story like this, you have to read the book and you've got to study the book. And so whatever efforts can be made, if people can get together in groups of 10 or 5 or whatever, read the book and read it together and discuss it, create study groups, because it's a lot of information, but it's a life-changing information, and it's the kind of life change that's got to happen in our country, because we need a new national narrative. We cannot start our story from 1652. We have to start discussing when our story must start, and then we must create the story. And Number 10 Publishers, which my daughter and I have just set up, this is one of our commitments, that we are going to lobby very hard and engage all of you in discussing how we're going to do this. So when our grandchildren or the children who grow up in the future, they will say, we 1500 years ago, there were people living in so-and-so, and then this happened and that happened. And then at some point we can say that there was a colonial disruption.
Then the strange thing happened.
There was a colonial disruption. But we cannot start our story in 1652. It has to stop now. And it doesn't have to depend on the education department or the government or anything. It depends on us as South Africans. We've got to take charge. And we can take charge. We've got brilliant minds just in this little small space. And we can do it. We mustn't get all upset and fight with one another. We just set out to do it. So in 10 years from now, we've got it, And that is a commitment that I make to the process. And I hope that there are people out there that take the initiative, that say, yes, I will do this. I will first study this book, and then I will do, this is my suggestion, But there's got to be a groundswell.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the question on the Fort Beaufort connection, I think what is Maxeke's connection to Fort Beaufort? Maxeke was born in Blankwater Valley, which is about 10 kilometers from Fort Beaufort. So whenever people refer to Fort Beaufort, it would be Maxeke's birthplace, which is located at about 10 kilometers, roughly 10 kilometers from Fort Beaufort.
And I want wanted to be cheeky, and I think I won't ruin the conversation tonight. I wanted to be cheeky and ask what was happening in Port Beaufort yesterday, but I won't ruin the evening.
Rather not.
We've had more questions come through, so that's exciting. Kollega, I think, makes a really important point on the thread. She says that erasure is methodical. It is very deliberate, and I think that's something that we've been discussing consistently today. I saw a question. Uthi Ulinda Vilagazi, to Zubeida and Thozama, how has working on this challenging, necessary project affected you personally? Yeah. I guess you can't emerge out of this without something shifting in you. I think that's such a beautiful question. Let's check. Uthi Akona, when will they fix archiving in SA tertiary institutions? That's a broad question, but the two doctors in the room, hello, hi. And then Amanda Kulu, hello Amanda, says, how do we address the exclusionary nature of some archives where we have to pay access to our own history? She says this has bothered her for years. And then there's just so much love. I see that Shireen Hassim is saying, thank you so much for a beautiful discussion. So we really are held today by all the beautiful feminist thinkers in this country. So it's so exciting to know that we are in community with so many amazing people. I can't read everyone's love, but just know that people are sending love, feminist solidarity. So thank you for this feminist labor of love.
Oh, there were harder questions in that round. Should we start with the question about how this has affected you personally?
It has had a deep impact on me because of the way in which the story came to me, and then the texts that I suddenly started reading that came from these early newspapers, and I was so baffled all the time that today we are so sophisticated and we don't write down all the things that we say, but Charlotte at that young age was already writing down what she was saying, but she was also attracting attention in foreign lands, and her words were recorded, besides in the country but outside the country. So that really shook me up. But what shook me up the greatest, really, I didn't know what was happening to me, was when somebody from I think, now I can't remember his name, but from David Philip Publishers, but it was close. He knew I was working on this book, and he said to me, Zubeida, it's just come to his attention that there's an exhibition in London of the choir, and that there are photographs that have been uncovered, photographs that were taken in a studio setting of the members of the choir. And then he said he was going to help me, and he was going to find some, and he was going to start sending it through. And then this photograph came through. And when this photograph, for those of you, you all can see us. I thought I'm talking into nothingness. This photograph came through that day, I tell you, because there I saw her eyes of this 21-year-old. This is the eyes of a 21-year-old looking at me. And my God, I don't think I was crying. I think I was just overwhelmed by almost the spiritual significance of it all. And I just thought, God, what's happening to me? What's happening here? What is going on? And I didn't want to sound or feel nutty or, crazy, but it was a feeling like that. And I thought, look at this person, look at this woman. Because by then I had already read things that she'd said, and then I saw this, but the pictures we had were all old pictures, of an older person. But this was the picture that came through of a young person. And I don't think I could really recover from that. And I am deeply, deeply concerned that we had to pay a lot of money to get these pictures. I'm only allowed to use these pictures for 10 years. And I think it was the first time in 125 years that we saw these pictures. And I think it's appalling. I think that our government, our arts and culture department, or whoever, has to take this up, bring these pictures back home, and it should be ours to use as we wish to use them. It's 125, I mean, it's now older, you know, it's very old. How can it belong to some people who are making money off it? It's our pictures. And we surely can make a case for that.
Yeah.
So people say, when I raise this, they say to me, so you need to take it up. And I say, no, I've done my work. Maybe there's somebody out there, maybe there's a young person out there who's prepared to make this his or her life mission, or, I mean, you know, focus for the next. It'll take time. But I can't do this. I can't take this on. It's a hard job. But these photographs must be brought back home. And we must be able to use it. They are delightful. They are delightful. Just not just us, but they are delightful photographs. And my favorite is, I can't catch it. Oh yeah, it is. My favorite is the photograph of these two young boys who are part of the choir. You know, it just shows such a level of confidence, and you know, it just shows how, you know, they're not yet affected by the ravages of apartheid and, you know, the complete squashing of the human spirit. They were still intact, you know, and singing. And that picture of those two little boys, you know, I think should be in every classroom. And so, yes, it affected me very deeply, whoever asked that question. Yeah, I just feel so concerned and deeply concerned that we don't devalue this person by not understanding, not studying, not reading, not really interrogating this life.
I'm so glad you spoke about the pictures, because I'm working on a book with Olisa Kuzula, and we were trying to get those pictures for a children's book. So it's an educational book. And they were charging us an arm and a leg. And I kept saying to them, look, we've fundraised for this book. There's X amount of money for this book, and we can't use them. So how are the children going to access them in a children's book? So it's a big question mark, and it's a justice question. It's a archival question. It's an access question. It's a political question. It's all these. It's so many questions. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thozama, Linda asked you, how did this affect you personally?
Hey, Linda.
I see that you want to avoid that question.
Linda kanjani? Well, you know, doing research on Charlotte Maxeke was an eye-opener, I would say. It changed my perspective of things, beginning with the very idea of doing historical research. Now, I came out understanding from that process that by design, historical research obliterates conventional methods of writing history, obliterates women. It writes them out. So understanding the workings of the process, how that kind of leaves women out, it was a very painful journey, I would say, because in thinking about Mama Maxeke's story, there have been a number of sketches of her life, her biography. I mean, as early as 1930, I mean, Sikota writes that book on Who's Who in Africa, the illustration of leading Africans at the time. So there have been efforts to document lives. But when it came to Mama Maxeke, her biographical sketch is sketchy in the true sense of the word. And that, for me, Linda, kind of opened my eyes to the reality that when using conventional methods of writing, you know, women are written out of they are in the history, but the process of writing itself, research, archiving, and everything that has to do with standard academic writing, it writes them out. So that was my really painful discovery. I came out of that process very bitter, because I so wanted to write a book on Charlotte Maxeke, a thesis on her. But before I could do that, I had to first deal with the archival question. So instead of writing about her achievements, one was limited because one had to do justice to just one segment of academic writing, which had to do with engaging the archive. So it's a very painful, it's hard labor, but it's something that we ought to do. It's not something that's just gonna happen by itself. So I came out a very changed person, I would say, Linda. It's a very painful journey, but it's a journey we all need to undertake in order to, as Zubeida was saying, begin to tell stories that reflect the lives of women like Maxeke, whose life history has been kind of erased from historical narratives.
Yeah, it is such a powerful process to do this work. I mean, we're still in it, but it's something you can't return from. So every week I went through a phase where I was like, can I just have 1 month where I don't discover anything new that the archive has erased? Because you're constantly moving from, and it's not newness in the sense of newness, it's just like, what more could have they tried to hide?
Yeah.
So I understand that bitterness. And then the questions of the archive, I can see you're stepping away from it, because I think it just needs more time to really do justice. Because, and I think higher education is part of the challenge, and it's actually not going to be the place that rescues us. And I think we must be very clear that those of us who are working in academia, in the space of historiography, in this place of the archive, we end up doing work elsewhere in order to be able to respond to that. It's actually not the saving grace. So that question about where the role of higher education in that is to say, let's find other institutions. And I think for me, I mean, we talk about this as heritage work, and I don't want to kind of do that thing of where is this and where is that, but if we don't have institutions that are custodians of our stories in the way of building institutions around different kinds of archives, that then becomes part of the problem. But the question of building institutions, I mean, this is an institution that's doing that. But one of the things that fascinated me about the, I mean, we talk about America being this behemoth of a place, but one of the things they are able to do that are they do that through history. They don't do that through, I mean, capital is part of the story about the American dream. The American dream is a historical idea. And every single town in America has a historical society. So where's the Joburg Historical Society? Where is the Kimberley Historical Society? Where is the Gqeberha Historical Society? Is that a nation is built on its history, but history is contested. And so where do we hold the spaces to be able to do that contestation? So I know that, you know, time is not on our side to have these conversations, and I don't want to extend what has been a really wonderful evening, but just to say to the both of you, thank you, ndingibamba ngazo zozibini, nisenza abantu in this country. I think people don't, at least for me, I understand, haven't been able to do my work. I wouldn't have been able to do the work that I do without the work that you two do. So I also just want to bring that into the room, and hopefully we'll meet again and be telling a different thread to the story, because we haven't spoken about her relationship with Masola Maxeke, for example, which is another kind of beautiful story. I don't know what kind of love story it was, but there's so many threads. The question of, I mean, there's so many questions, I won't go into them now, otherwise that will be part 2. But thank you from the bottom of my heart, and really umsebenzi wenu umkhulu, and it is so necessary, and I think it's generational work, and so thank you for doing that labor, and thank you to the Forge.
Okay.
Greetings to our guests and greetings to people who are currently watching online and people who will be watching this discussion later, future generations who will watch this in many years to come. My name is Moelela Cele. I'm the Core Director of Public Programs here at the Forge. On behalf of the Forge and my colleagues, I would like to express our appreciation and gratitude. Please forgive me for using first names to Zubeida, Thozama, and Athambile. Thank you for the intellectual work, the insights and content that you have so generously shared with us. This program today has been beautiful, brilliant, and engaging, an excellent way to pay homage to Mam Charlotte Maxeke, who will forever occupy a permanent place among the galaxy of exemplars and role models. I also want to thank Rushka, who has been working very closely with us in organizing this program and has contributed so much to this collaboration. Sincere thanks to my colleagues at the Forge and the Commune, and to our friends at Between Productions who are doing the live stream. Lastly, and definitely not least, I'd also like to congratulate Zubeida and Rushka on the establishment of Number 10 Publishers, and wish you every success and a bright future. Thank you very much.